What are you really after? When you ask a question like, will only a few people be saved? What is the real question, the deeper motivation? I think it could be several things. Most of them aren't good. Most of them come back to some form of pride. We might just want to know how many people will be saved out of a simple desire to be right, to have the answer. The one who asks Jesus this question is probably thinking about a debate that was going on amongst Jewish rabbis at the time. They had had this question of how many will be saved, and there were different schools of thought. And it's likely that this man agreed with one rabbi or the other and was looking for confirmation that he and his side were the right side. But some truths are not ours to know. Or we might ask such a question because we're not certain about our own fate. Rather than being vulnerable and outright exposing our own insecurity, we might use a question like this to get an indirect answer, to make it look scholarly rather than as an expression of personal fear or doubt. But hiding our weakness and our fear doesn't erase it. Or perhaps we have, consciously or unconsciously, developed a list of qualifications for who will be saved, and we're thinking of people who aren't saved because they don't measure up. And we're looking for confirmation that we have judged rightly. This can also be a way of us judging God. We might instinctively assume that we know what's fair and what isn't. And so we want to test and see if God's idea of justice matches up with our own. A lot of people claim to not believe in God, but are really just mad that his idea of justice doesn't fit their own. There's possibly another dangerous assumption buried in this question. The man asks, will only a few be saved? Probably assumes he's one of the few. The Jews are God's chosen people, beneficiaries of the covenant. So many of them assumed that they were going to be saved and the many Gentiles would not. And so because he's already a Jew, he's including himself in that number. And Jesus goes out of his way to make a point that the Gentiles, people from east and west, north and south, will be saved, and that some Jews will not. And that tells us that Jesus saw this assumption and wanted to address it head on. Still, when Jesus does this usual thing of not answering the question directly, his response gives a way to avoid those potential pitfalls of pride. Rather than settle an academic debate, his response slaps down arrogance and challenges us to focus more on what really matters: our own salvation. It's clear from the first word he says in response: strive. Even in the Greek, that first word is agonizesthē, which you might notice sounds a lot like agonize. That connection is helpful to remember when we reflect on that second reading, telling us to accept suffering and trial as the loving discipline of God. That we should strive to remain faithful even when it is agonizingly difficult. Perseverance, striving even when it's hard, is the way to heaven. So how many people are going to be in heaven? To put it bluntly, it's not your business. You will not get an answer. Just as Jesus refused to tell us when the second coming is, so he will not give us the final numbers or percentages. And when people get fixated, either on the second coming or the total number of people in heaven, their focus is in the wrong place. There's really only one reason I can think of that's a good motivation to ask this question: a love of other people. There's a basic desire to get people to heaven, and that can spark a desire to know whether or not it's possible. So if I'm going to spend the time and energy trying to bring people into the spiritual life and into heaven, maybe I want to know how hard it's going to be. This desire for other people's happiness and salvation can spark this curiosity. But saving everyone is not your job. There's only so many people you can reach. Focus on them, not questions about the ones you can't. Besides the fact that knowing the final number doesn't help you change it. The same is true for most anything worth doing in this life. Take marriage or priesthood or the religious life, being a brother or nun. People want to know before they do it. Will we make it? Am I going to be able to handle this way of life? Marriage is hard. So is the priesthood and the religious life. Most people know that going in. Yet there's a lot of people that could tell you, if they knew just how hard, they wouldn't have tried. But that they're glad they didn't know, and they're glad they made it through. There's also the opposite problem. If we think something is too easy, we'll take it for granted and fail. If you take a friendship for granted and never reciprocate, you lose that friend. You take your health for granted and never eat healthy or exercise, you will lose it. If you take your job too lightly, you could lose it. So what Jesus is telling us makes perfect sense when you consider the effort involved in anything worth doing, even if we don't know the outcome. So in this case, Jesus gives us what we need to know and nothing more. Getting to heaven is hard. The gate is narrow, and it takes work. It requires strength. For the benefit of his immediate audience, Jesus makes it clear that simply being a Jew is not enough. The same is true for simply being a Christian. Once saved, always saved is obviously false. Don't fall for it. Just reading Scripture is not enough. Simply hearing a homily is not enough. Just eating and drinking with Jesus, just going to Mass, is not enough if you are not striving. Should we hope that everyone goes to heaven? It's the wrong question, because the very idea of everyone isn't real enough to us to matter in daily life. Should I hope that I go to heaven? Yes, if you strive for it. Should I hope that the people I can help make it to heaven? Yes, if you strive to help them. The gate is narrow and many will not be strong enough, so strive. And don't worry about the final numbers. And yet is anyone strong enough? No, actually. That's the part of the reason that Jesus so strongly rejects the prideful reasons behind this question. You can't assume you're already in the few because you're weak. You can't determine who else is in or out because your judgment is not God's. So you want to know what matters? Humility in knowing your limits and dependence. Faith in that you strive to trust God. Love in that you strive to do as he commanded. Strive to cooperate with God's grace, because that's the only way anyone gets to heaven, by the grace of God. Persevere in grace. Strive after grace. And leave the rest